Hello, and welcome to Teaching It Real. My name's Mark Enser. I'm a Head of Geography and Research Lead at Heathfield Community College and author of many books, including the co-author of Generative Learning in Action. And I'm with
Zoe Enser, Mark's wife, and I'm a ex-head of English, an English teacher for 20 years, and I'm currently working as an advisor for the education people across Kent.
And we are very excited to be joined by Adam Riches, who is an assistant principal and head of English and the author of the fantastic Teach Smarter. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you here. Now, what really excited me about writing this book was not just the kind of really interesting research that underpins it from Farella and Mayer, but the whole inaction of the inaction kind of series that Tom Sherrington has pulled together. And the idea that what we're trying to do is to take the research out of the kind of the sphere of academia and put it into the classroom. And that's why we've kind of asked Adam to come along. We're going to be doing similar with other people who've written case studies for our book, because we actually want to see what happens in the classroom with this and how powerful it can be, and explore maybe some of the issues that are related to it as well, and how we can make the best of it. So Adam, you've written the section for us in our summarising chapter, focusing on Cornell notes. Can you just tell us a little bit about that for people who perhaps aren't familiar with them?
So Cornell note-taking is a method used in the American university, and it's something that was actually introduced to me, ironically, by one of my lecturers when I was at university in Newcastle. And I was doing computational linguistics. I couldn't seem to get my head around some of the concepts. And he showed me the note-taking method to kind of take the place of the chronological note-taking that I'd been, as I would say, trained to do, but just the thing that I'd naturally picked up to do throughout my education. And it completely and utterly changed the way in which I recorded information, and significantly helped me with the memorization of that information and the processing of the logic. And it's just something that stuck with me. And it wasn't until recently, actually, that I even considered application of this in my own teaching, because there always seems to be that strange divide between what you do and then what children do. But actually, the more I look into these kind of things, the more adults learn quite similarly to children. So I thought it would be a good idea to try it out. And there is some momentum behind it as an approach already. It's just, it doesn't seem to be as mainstream or widespread as some other approaches. So it's just something really, like I say, that worked for me, and I think worked quite well for children as well.
How long have you been trying it in the classroom?
So it's a funny thing in the classroom, because as with anything, children aren't necessarily too adaptable to change when it comes to something they do every single lesson, and for every single day for however many years that they've done something else. So when you say, right, we're not going to take notes in the same way that we previously have, to then get them to do something very, very different can be quite tricky. So from the outset, it's just been modelling and scaffolding how to effectively note take in a different way, and something that's obviously brilliant for is summarisation of information after learning, or during learning.
And have you seen the kind of impacts of this at the moment? Is there something that you would say is quite measurable with this approach?
I think with regard to the revision, there's a notable kind of tangibility around actually seeing what's been learned when you use Cornell note-taking, because as opposed to chronological note-taking, you can almost see where the misunderstandings are taking place. So the student themselves can see, but as a teacher also, it's a lot easier to monitor where misconceptions are arising. With chronological notes, quite often, students can just copy down information they're hearing or seeing, and what you actually end up doing is getting a kind of false dichotomy of what's been learned, what hasn't been learned, and you get really confused between the realities of what is going on and what isn't. And obviously the other thing is that the students make themselves feel better by writing a lot, but by writing a lot doesn't mean they've learned a lot. Whereas what Cornell notes kind of do is they separate that, and because they break the revision down significantly, or break the learning down a lot more, you're able to see in those different sections where the learning is taking place.
That's what I really like about Cornell notes. In actually, you can use the different sections generatively. And as you say, it's that meaningful learning. So the summary is one part of it, but actually you could get them when they're making their notes. That's quite a generative, especially activity, especially if they're retrieving it and having to organise that. And we've talked about kind of how you could almost use concept maps in that area as well, if that's how you wanted the students to present it. And then you've got that potential for the self-testing that comes into it as well. So I think they could be really, really clever. And it sounds like you're using it in a very clever way yourself.
Have you?
Like you've just touched on the concept maps thing, and that's one of the other things about it. For some students who don't like writing as much, they're able to summarize information effectively and still feel like they're succeeding in the same way as those who do write a lot. Obviously, with images, concept maps, all those different approaches. One of the big things I do when we do Cornell notes is just say there aren't any rules for what you put in that box. It's absolutely up to you as to what you put in, but obviously it has to make sense to you. And again, that's just something that needs to be modelled quite carefully to begin with.
That's ownership of, it's ownership of their learning though there as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So have you rolled this out in English, or is this something you've kind of taken across the school?
So we piloted it in English. I did it in English a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. We piloted it in English for our revision for the last year group that actually went through real exams, not the CAGs. And the interesting real exams. The interesting thing was it was taken up really quickly for English, because the way in which we'd designed it, obviously being an English teacher myself, was kind of geared towards English. A friend of mine did some whole school training on it, and it seemed to be something that other departments were also interested in as well. So we kind of we put our heads together and came up with almost a universal outline or a template for how we could use Cornell notes in the school. And then pre-lockdown, we were sort of rolling that out and training the kids how to fill those in. But what we've done this year is we've taken that a step further, and we're teaching them in base group time or form time, whatever you'd like to call it, how to do these different study skills. And Cornell notes obviously is going to make up a big part of that. So it's one of those things that started kind of as an individual, then it went to department level, and then we've been trying to push it whole school. And it's not so much because we think it's going to be something that's going to revolutionise the learning, but what we do think is it's going to significantly increase the efficiency of the learning. And along with other things that we're trying to put into place, I think Cornell Notes is going to make the learning and the revision a lot more accessible for the students who we're teaching.
It's one of those things that I think I found with generative learning is that it helps to have that common language across the school. So none of these things seem to be revolutionary on their own, but actually having those common approaches where students know what you mean by. So when a teacher once says we can use Cornell Notes, or they say we're going to do a mind map, or they know what that means, and it just saves that kind of cognitive space rather than having to constantly think, how do I do this? They just know it's the same.
And this is something I've written about a few times for SEC Ed, TES, various people, but the commonality of language between staff and students is so important, because if you both know what you're talking about, that communication is so much clearer, your practice is so much more efficient. And I think with commonality of language between teachers on a training level, for example, that's so important. But again, it's translating that into the adult student. There's not a huge void. It's the same thing. The same concept. If you both know what you're talking about, then the learning is going to be so much better. And like you say, if they know what you're talking about, when you say something, it saves you 5 minutes of explaining what that thing is. If you then factorize that across however many lessons, that's a serious amount of extra learning time.
You mentioned the word efficiency, and that's often what we're seeking, isn't it? To kind of make it the most efficient way to ensure that real learning is taking place.
Yeah, more so this year than any year, really, considering that we've got serious deficit with regard to time. And if we're thinking about how can we make time from not having enough time, well, one of the best ways is to not waste time talking about things you don't need to waste time about.
Very well put.
Indeed. Now, you've mentioned one of the things that you really need to do is to kind of train students, make sure there's that commonality and modelling. Are there any other things that you think people need to be aware of when they're introducing Cornell Notes, just to kind of be mindful of, or problems that perhaps you came across and you overcame?
I think one of the big things is understanding that, as with anything with teaching, you have to be comfortable doing it yourself before you try and teach it. It's something I always talk to the trainees that I work with about, and it's something that obviously I push a lot within department, but you need to make sure you're confident with doing something before you start trying to explain it to the students, because otherwise you'll start getting questions that you're not comfortable answering, and that's when you then almost undermine the process by accident. And quite often the modelling process does help the students significantly with that, but the concept of summarization is very personal as well, so you have to have a variety of ways in which you can teach them to summarize the information. I very much am into bullet points. I just really like bullet points, but they don't work for everybody, and I'm not particularly good with drawings or pictures, but then I know other people are significantly better with drawings and pictures, so it's kind of getting that balance between knowing, right, well, that works for me personally, how could somebody else use this, and how could it work for them? And with students as well, it's about that confidence, so it's about building the confidence in the approach for the students. But again, it's like Mark said, it's a piece in the puzzle as well. So it's about them understanding that it's a piece in the puzzle, and it's just an alternative approach that they could potentially use to make their learning more efficient.
So I was thinking about kind of generative learning in general. When we've been talking to people about this book, as we now do all of the time, we walk around in supermarkets, trying to strike up conversations with strangers about it. But even in kind of education, we don't meet many people who had read Fiorella and Meyer's paper or work originally. Is it something you had come across before?
Yeah, it's interesting. A friend of mine, Dr. Ian Rogers, one of the science teachers at my school, he's really keen on all this. So actually, it's quite nice because I've spoken to him a number of times about it, and it's when you get that kind of like, oh, I've read that. And we're really lucky because in our school we do centralised CPD, we do department CPD, but we also have something we call pedagogy groups, and within those groups, there's 4 groups. Teachers choose which one to join, and he actually ran last year one of the groups, and he focused on research in action essentially. So it was really interesting because a lot of the things you discuss in the book were things that I've heard being touched upon and read about myself, and as part of the pedagogy groups they do some kind of action research and bits as well. So it's really nice to see all of these different things coming together, and where we focus very much on as we have for 3 or 4 years, on Rosenshine's principles of instruction. This gives that kind of like, and I think you've described it as this before, it's that flip side to Rosenshein, and I think it's so important to understand the other side and to not just focus too much on the direct instruction, because we need to bear in mind that students need the skills in place to be able to learn, not just us doing the right things as well.
Absolutely, the materials may be fantastic, but if they never do anything with them, then that's not really going to be learning. That's just going to be quite a passive process, and that's what generative learning kind of shifts us away from.
Yeah, and it's that other thing, isn't it? That building self-efficacy in a person is something that's so important for their future as well. We only have a limited amount of time with the students to be able to help them through, and all these strategies help them to process stuff, and that's what they're going to have to do for the rest of their lives. They're not going to be writing about inspector calls after they leave school, but they certainly are going to be having to summarise information. And actually, like the way the world's going, they're having to now summarise information on such a different scale and process information on such a different scale. To when I was younger, the internet wasn't. Well, it was just somewhere where you got some pictures off or whatever to stick on the front of your books. It wasn't like, you didn't have to decipher what was real and what wasn't. And, all these thinking processes are really important.
They're bombarded by information, aren't they, all the time?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Now, we mentioned at the beginning that you not only have written for us, but you're a TES author and have written for other publications, but you've also got your own book as well, Teach Smarter.
Oh, I love that book.
Which is aimed at early careers teachers, isn't it? Can you just tell us a bit about what prompted you to write that?
Yeah, thanks anyway to Mark, because Mark had a good look at it early doors, and it's one of those things, isn't it? Like with a book, and I'm sure you'll both agree, you start writing it and you think, is this a good idea? Because is anyone going to read it? But I wrote that book simply because I just used to do this training for different ITT providers, and used to talk to trainees, work with trainees, and all they'd ever talk to me about is the workload, constant workload. And I just think, does anyone ever teach you how to make sure you aren't doing unnecessary stuff? And I just think traditionally teaching's always been about, oh, well, I was in at 7 this morning and I'm still in school till 7 last night. It's like some kind of badge of honour. And I've always been like, nah, I'm off at 3:30. I'll see you later. Like, I actually think if I can do all my work while I'm at work, that means I can enjoy myself outside of work. And then when I come back to work, I can be better at what I do. And the book really was kind of just hoping that it'd help a few people cut down on their workload so they could just be better teachers when they are actually in school. And I mean, personally, I know that I've been really lucky in the sense that I've worked in schools where I've been allowed to kind of explore some of these ideas. And I know some people have limitations around what they can and can't do, but I tried to be very mindful of that. So it kind of focused on what you personally can do to reduce your workload. And I think it resonated fairly well with a few people. I think some people have just been looking at trying to save time in a particular area. Some people are just basically saying, like, please help me with time across my life. And, you know, it's hopefully it's been received relatively well. I think it has. But yeah, I just wanted to save some people some time and get their lives back.
I just found it a massive breath of fresh air. It's one of those books which I just hope schools are buying for their NQTs, for their RQTs, and saying, you know, it doesn't have to be this way. There is another way of working that means you'll stay in teaching for a long time, and that's what we need as experienced teachers. We're not going to get them if they drop out after 2 years because of workload. Well,
this is the thing, and it sounds silly. You put so much time into people, and you really support them through these things, and you don't want them to say, well, I can't do it anymore because I've got too much marking to do. I'm thinking, but why have you got too much marking to do? You don't, you know, and quite often it is just archaic policy that causes the issue. And, you know, on a personal level, I hope it helps individuals, but also if anybody in leadership reads it, thinking, oh, well, this is just for early career teachers, not me because I'm really experienced. Hopefully they see it and think, actually, have we looked at our feedback policy, or have we thought about the way in which we're getting teachers to organise their rooms and make displays and do all these things? Because actually, maybe we could update our own kind of practice around it.
We need to take control of that, don't we, both as leaders and as individuals, and say we're not just going to let it run amok, because it is that kind of job where it really could if we allowed it to.
Yeah, and it's that whole thing as well, isn't it? Like, it's easy to say, well, I don't want to do as much marking, but if, again, you don't have that kind of like language to be able to say, because it's not efficient because of this, you know, you don't have an argument. So it's not like people are going to go to their SOT and be like, I don't want to do as much marking. But they say, well, what's the alternative? We say, well, actually, we could do the marking in the class. All right, well, brilliant. Let's give that a go. You know, it just hopefully empowers some people to make some more positive changes around workload. And like I say, I'm no slacker, but at the same time, I really quite enjoy being able to say, right, well, work's finished. It's time now for family or whatever else.
Being roped into recording webinars on a Sunday evening.
Yeah, well, absolutely, but it's you two, so it's fine.
So something that I've been meaning to ask ever since I finished reading Teach Smarter, are you working on another book? Is there a sequel?
Not at the moment. I was a friend of mine we've spoken about a leadership book that I'd very much like to write. Kind of around the same topic, the whole concept of maybe leading a bit smarter and thinking a bit more about your ethical leadership and the way in which you sort of like approaching. But at the moment, that is in the sort of, let's say, brainstorming stages. But I would very much like to do another one, and just, you know, going through the process again, as you both know, it's just such an interesting thing to go through. And, you know, the feedback's very, very nice. And sometimes people will say, well, had you considered this, or it's not got enough pictures in, or like, what? I don't understand. But at the same time, it's really interesting to put yourself out there, and, you know, it is quite daunting, but also it's really rewarding, isn't it?
Definitely. That's what I always love it, when people want to talk about the ideas and want to say how it may or may not have had an impact on them. You know, if they're talking about it and teachers are kind of exploring these things, that for me is exciting.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, if people are talking about teaching, that's all I care about, because there's nothing worse than being siloed and isolated and thinking that you have to just keep grinding because there's kind of no one there to help you. And you get those wilderness years, don't you? ITT, you get loads of support. NQT, you get good helping hand from a mentor, and then suddenly you're sort of RQT, and then you're in the big wide world by yourself. Like, what is there? So any discussion around teaching, I absolutely love, and that self-betterment, or a betterment for the success of your students, is, I think, is dead important, and it keeps us sane, doesn't it? Like, teaching's an ever-changing practice. We're always in a state of flux. So, the things I write about, or the things you two write about this year or in 2 years' time, it might be something totally different. But that's part of the magic of it, isn't it? And that's what I really enjoy, really.
It's definitely never a boring occupation to be involved in at all, is it? That's brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much for your contribution, and thank you for talking to us this evening. And I'm definitely going to be looking out for more projects from you, especially around leadership. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks so much for asking me to be a part of it. I really appreciate it, and it's such an incredible resource, and I think genuinely it's going to have a real impact on some students. So brilliant.
Thank you.
Bye.